Hey friends, welcome to the Kidsman Collective podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Ralston, and today's episode is called Parent Volunteers, Rethinking Who and How We Ask to Serve. So, we're going to talk in this episode today just about reimagining the role of parents in volunteering in your ministry and exploring how churches can wisely invite teen parents rather than the overwhelmed young parents of littles into serving in your ministry. And so let's connect and figure out what that could look like for your ministry. So, one of the things that I had dreamed about in my vision and my hope in children's ministry. So, for a little bit of context, we had a pretty big church, and our student ministry, because it was so big and they only had one space to meet, we had seventh, eighth, and ninth grade met during one service, and 10th and 11th and 12th grade met in a different service. So if you had a parent on campus who had a seventh grader and a ninth grader, they met different, seventh grader and a 10th grader, they met in two different service times, right? So they had to be present for two services. Their seventh grader went to the middle service, and their 10th grader went to the last service of the day. So now mom and dad are here for two services, and both of those students are there for two services. One of them, they're worshiping in their own service, and then what do they do for the second service? So my dream and my vision for that was, why are we in, at the time I was overseeing preschool ministry, so young families, right? Why are we asking over and over and over our parents of toddlers and preschoolers in early childhood to volunteer in those age groups? I'm not saying you can never do that, but my dream and my heart for that was to say, parents of teenagers, you have been there, you've done that, you've moved out of the stage of toddlers and littles. You're probably way less sleep deprived, maybe just sleep deprived in a different way, but from exhaustion of traveling and sports and all the things that come with shuttling around teenagers. But you're not in the stage of having these littles anymore where you're up every few hours feeding, or you're home often for nap times, and you're not getting a lot of adult interactions and things like that. Like, those two seasons are so different. So my vision and my dream was, okay, parents of teenagers who are here for two services, worship one of those hours, just like your student is worshiping. And then the other hour, you can volunteer as a leader in the children's ministry, so that the parents of our littles don't have to do that. They don't have to feel this obligation to, my kids in this ministry, I have to be here, but we give them respite and the ability to go to church and to worship and not have to be around littles and to sit and be filled, but also then to have adult conversations with other people in the same stage of life. And so that was my dream. That was my vision. So I'm going to preface this in this podcast. I am not saying this is how you have to do it. That is not it at all. I think that there are definitely some parents of very small children who are passionate about that age group and would love to serve, even though they have children in that age group. So this is not you have to do it one way fits all. This is how it has to be. This is just a real and heartfelt just explanation of what I would love to see for ministries. And so again, just kind of my heart in that, not that there's a right or wrong way to do it, but just wanted to share that. So as I kind of watched this play out in my ministry, I noticed a couple of things. That when I started asking parents of littles, basically preschool and under, I was seeing much higher turnover in those teachers because they were getting burnt out really fast. They were exhausted. They were trying to deal with littles at home. They were showing up to church to deal with littles. Like, that was just a lot for them. And so they would serve and they would do it for a little while. They might be fantastic teachers, but they just ultimately couldn't commit long term. And so I would see a lot of turnover in those parents that I was asking. And I would often see a lot of those parents would sort of feel this obligation to do it. So they would say, okay, well, they serve for 3 months and then they say, I just can't do this right now. I'll contact you when I can do it again. And then they would, several months later be like, I think I'm in a better place. And then serve for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And then I can't do this right now. So it is okay to give them permission to not serve in this capacity right now. There isn't an obligation. They don't have to do that. The other thing that I saw often is when parents of littles are serving, they often are not going to church. Littles have to eat often and they have to nap often, and they likely are on a lot of schedules and routines, and church always falls somewhere in that morning nap time. And so kiddos get cranky. Mom and dad don't want to have them at church for 2 hours. And so I would see several things play out in this. If mom was serving, but dad wasn't, mom was not going to church because dad was going to church during the service, but mom was serving in a kid's room. And then mom and dad now aren't going to church together, or both parents are serving together and they're saying, we don't want to bring our kids for 2 services. So we're only going to come for one service and we're just going to volunteer. And so this ultimately is very unhealthy. First of all, mom and dad need to be worshiping together. That's a key part of their discipleship and super important for them to be doing together to be filled up spiritually. But also, this is for them to just be showing up and serving. They're never being poured into. And if they're not worshiping together, that's not a healthy dynamic. So ultimately, at the end of the day, if parents aren't going to church and they're just volunteering, it's really not the most beneficial thing. If the bottom line is we're calling people to be disciples of Jesus, they need to be spiritually filled. I mean, we see Jesus pull away from the crowds many, many times to go off into the quiet and to pray and to be alone and to be with his Father. And so if we're asking people to fill a role in a job but not to be spiritually filled, they are not going to be successful in that position long term. So those are kind of my main reasons behind the scenes for why I want to call these parents of teenagers to be the ones to step into these roles and to step into leading the littles so that the parents of the littles can be poured into and invested into and loved and discipled, right? So young parents are often feeling overwhelmed, especially if they're new to parenting. They just have a lot of stuff going on. The needs of a young child are much greater demand on young parents. Not that teenagers are not demanding, that is not it at all, but just that need for, a toddler can't take care of himself like a teenager can. A teenager can get themselves out of bed, they can feed themselves, they can, make sure they get dressed for school, and they're not dependent on mom and dad to do every single thing. And that dependent on mom and dad to do every single thing is time consuming and draining. And so then to put those parents into a classroom with 12 children who will also need them to do that for a whole hour, that's just a lot. So when parents are feeling overwhelmed, that's a hard space often for them to serve in. And so if serving doesn't feel like a joy and it feels like an obligation, they're probably not going to be around very long. And so considering what that looks like, trying to figure out how to get parents into a role that makes sense for them in a season that makes sense for them, and really just working with families. So if you're trying to retain families longer and foster this long-term discipleship, burnout is not going to be the way to do that. So maybe this season of discipleship looks like loving these parents, not asking them to serve, but instead saying, how can I pour into you? How can I equip you to be a disciple maker at home? How can I disciple you in this season? How do I, you know, help you as you are navigating the challenging parts of young parenthood? And so again, I want to mention the caveat here is that this isn't the case for every single parent. For example, in our children's ministry, when I was on staff, we had this mom who was phenomenal and she loved nursery. She did not care how old the child was, birth till they were one. She would be with any baby that she could help with. And she was so flexible. She would move between classrooms and she loved it. And so she had, in the time that she was volunteering, she had 2 children and she served before she had kids. Then she had their oldest, and she took a break when the baby was born. And she said, okay, the baby is ready to go to the nursery, and I'm ready to start serving again. And so she would come by herself to the early service, the first service, and her husband would get the child ready for church and bring them for the second service. And then mom and dad would worship together, and the child would go to the nursery. And so she did this for a while, had their second kid, same thing. She took a small break and then came back, and she loved it and she was passionate about it. And that's where she wanted to be. She felt like God called her there. She was a stay-at-home mom, but she felt like the Lord was leading her to serve. And so again, I am not saying that no parent in an early childhood stage could ever serve in your classroom. That is not it. There are definitely people who are unique to that situation, and that's a life-giving thing to them. But just being sensitive to those needs of, is this the best place, or is this the best season for this parent to be serving in this capacity? So just considering that, just thinking through that, and figuring out kind of what that looks like for the current people serving in your ministry, the current needs that you have in your ministry, and what your church dynamic and demographic looks like, right? And so some of the wins that I think I have seen in this idea of the parents of teenagers serving is those parents are in a busy season, but it's a different busy season, right? So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but volunteering can look different for them, and it maybe doesn't feel so overwhelming in that season like the season of a mom of a little would be, right? So at that point, many of those parents are likely ready to pour back into the church and that once served their kids. And so even casting that vision in that way to say, hey, you had teachers that were loving and pouring into your children when you were a young parent. Now you get the opportunity to do that again. And remember how influential that was and how helpful and supportive that was. Now you get that opportunity to do that for these young moms and dads. So again, just framing it and teaching them, hey, this is what you get to do. A bonus to that is also that, for example, what I shared is that we had, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade going to one service, 10th, 11th, 12th going to a different service, and they're there for 2 services. Well, now whatever service that mom and dad are going to volunteer, they can invite the kid who doesn't have a service to, like their own student ministry service, to come alongside them and serve. And that's discipleship, right? That's mom and dad modeling for this student. This is how you serve. This is what it looks like to be in a classroom. This is how we volunteer to love these kids. This is why we're doing this. And so they're actively discipling their own children by serving together. And so that's a multi-generational discipleship in motion in your ministry. And so what a beautiful picture of discipleship and intentionality in leading in seasons that make sense. And so as you can tell, this is a passion point of mine, and I just think that there's so much value in considering leadership in that way. So how do we make that happen? What does this look like? If this is a model that makes sense for you and your church and your ministry, how do you do that, right? Like those are the practical things. So first things first is you will need to, first of all, need to know exactly what are the positions you need filled. I'm sure you know those because you're you know, finagling a schedule every week to make sure your classrooms are covered. I know that you operate often on a bare minimum of volunteer leaders, and you're thinking, if only I had these leaders to do this. Make a note of that and make that known and clear. And cast the vision of what your needs are and be clear with those expectations of what those roles will look like to the parents of teenagers in your church. Invite them into service. Maybe that looks like a tag and a quick announcement at the beginning of a meeting that you have for student ministry, right? Maybe they're getting ready to go to camp and they're calling a meeting together so parents can know about this camp. Say, hey, student ministry staff, can I come in for a quick minute, just chat with your your families, and just tell them this is what we're asking for. A lot of those parents may not even know that you have that need, and they might not know you're asking for that. So work with your leadership team as a staff as a whole, both with student ministries, but also with your church pastors and staff, to figure out, how do we get in front of these parents to communicate this need and cast this vision, and ultimately invite them to step into these serving positions and roles. Figure out what are some creative ways you can pair them with their students, meaning their teenagers. What are those roles that the student leaders would be filling? How does a parent come alongside that? Can mom serve in one space with one kid and dad serve in another space with another kid? What are those opportunities and options for them to do that? So be creative in how you would be willing to engage those student leaders and ultimately their parents with that. And like I briefly mentioned earlier, but clarifying those expectations, make this a discipleship opportunity. Again, mom and dad discipling their own children by serving alongside them as students and teaching them when they're 14 years old, what does it look like to serve and to lead? But also discipling the children of the next generation, right? And so that is multi-generations of discipleship, discipling each other and teaching a young adult basically to be a disciple maker. And so it is not just a task of, okay, you're going to be a student leader and you got to pick up toys. There's a lot more to it than that, right? And we get the ability and the opportunity to communicate the gospel to these kids and to these families, and to love our families in the church as a whole. So you don't have to stop asking all parents to serve, but just be strategic in who you're asking. Be thoughtful about understanding what season a parent is in, and filled with grace when you say, this parent probably wants to step out, but maybe they don't feel like they can do that. Give them the permission to do that. Allow them to step out, but also don't shy away from asking parents in a different season to step in and fill that need. Sometimes they simply don't know that that's the need. So be strategic, be willing to communicate that, be willing to ask, and be willing to give grace where grace is needed in that. So, I think I just want to encourage you to just rethink what your recruitment conversations look like. Again, this is not a model that it may not work for everybody, and that's okay. But the way that our staff laid out our services and our students and our kids and volunteers, this was something that was just very heavy on my heart to be able to implement. And it was just a passion point of mine to be able to start asking those parents of teenagers to volunteer in that space. And so just take some time to consider, what is my recruitment strategy? Who are the people I'm actively asking to recruit? Am I burning out leaders because I'm asking people over and over and over? Am I asking the wrong people to serve in these roles? Just consider that. Pray. Ask the Lord who he would have you talk to or ask, or if there's somebody specific he's putting on your heart, go and have the conversation. Make the ask. See where that leads and what the Lord is going to do through that. So if you want to process through and reimagine who you're asking, what your strategy is for recruitment to create a culture where you have healthy, bought-in leaders who aren't burnt out, and you want to create a long-term volunteer leader strategy, I would love to talk to you about that. I would be happy to help you map out a plan specific to your church, specific to your staff team, specific to your unique circumstances, your services. Do you only have one church service? Do you have students always go to the same service? What does that look like? Book a call. There's a link on my homepage to be able to do that. And so I would love to chat with you. I have a free 30-minute call available. So just hop on there, book that call, and I will also post the link to that in the description of this podcast. And until next week, I hope you have a great week, and we will talk to you again soon. Thanks for joining me today on the Kidsmen Collective podcast, where we're all about nurturing leaders and impacting generations. Before you go, I want to invite you to take the next step in growing your ministry with confidence. I've created a free Kidsmen Leader Assessment designed just for leaders like you. It walks you through the 5 key areas: purpose, people, programming, physical space, and procedures, helping you celebrate what's going well and uncover where there's room to grow. Whether you're a brand new leader or you've been leading for years, this tool will give you a clear picture of where your ministry stands and where it could go with a little strategy and support. Head over to ozarkministryconsulting.com to get started. You'll find the assessment right on the homepage, quick, simple, and packed with insight. And if this episode encouraged you, share it with a fellow leader or leave a review. We're better when we grow together. Until next time, keep leading well, keep loving big, and remember, your ministry matters.